Should Olympic athletes be able to jump the line and get vaccines before the rest of us? So, as you may know, the Tokyo Olympics are still set to go this July. And while the International Olympic Committee is not mandating vaccines, they say, don't worry, you don't have to have them to compete. They are still encouraging all of the local governments to say, hey, but if they can get a vaccine, it probably wouldn't hurt. So this really starts to set up something in all of our countries. Should athletes like Olympic athletes be able to jump the line for vaccines?
Well, in Canada, we're talking about 230 athletes getting the vaccine, maybe before us, maybe after us. And when I weigh that against the entertainment and probably a great deal of joy that watching these athletes and 11,000 others compete against each other, it seems like kind of reasonable. But then I get tripped up because it's not just athletes gathering. There are tens of thousands of people who make any Olympics game happen. And when I think about those people, the service people, the assistants, many of whom will have to pass through airports, staffing hundreds of other people's, the ripple effect of COVID spreading is kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's worth it.
Yeah,
I
great
don't
point, Jess.
think so. I mean, I just think, imagine, like right now, Canadians are getting increasingly frustrated, and for good reason. Like we've had these shifting timelines. We don't know when any of our loved ones are even going to get necessarily vaccinated. It's not totally clear. And then I'm thinking of all those other people who are frontline workers of varying degrees. Like I'm thinking about cab drivers. I'm thinking about teachers. The idea that even some athletes, even if it's a small number, just like you pointed out, getting ahead of the line, it just doesn't
looks
seem
bad.
right.
Yeah.
It doesn't. And for what? Like, do we actually believe that like the reason why like there's sort of murky motivation. I don't think that the motivation from the IOC is for, what you're saying, Jess, about like, oh, it brings joy. That's not it's money. They're doing this for money.
I mean, you can't discount the joy.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been all watching NBA and NFL, like just Super Bowl just happened, and MLB. I mean, it seems to be able to be done, and sports fans are like, yeah, thank God we have something to watch on TV.
It's like that's an interesting point, because that's the amnesia, right? Like at the beginning of the pandemic, when, pro sports teams were announcing that they were coming back, a lot of people were like, no, it's so unsafe. Even Yasik was like stomping up and down this house being like, I can't believe it. They shouldn't do it. And then cut to the sports starting again. And he's like in front of the TV going, I gotta watch the game. I gotta watch the game. I feel like we all have amnesia about this.
It's true. But I will say that the messaging seems a little off for me. That's the thing. Like the way that professional sports has been doing it, they've been trying different versions of bubbles, right? So right now we have all of the Canadian NHL teams only playing in Canada against themselves. So they're not traveling. I mean, not traveling outside of the country. But then it seems like the messaging of Olympics is international competition. It's like the opposite message that every government is telling their people. That's the part I have a hard time with. Nobody get together, but all of these athletes, you get together.
Well, that's
yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
That's interesting because this is a worldwide pandemic, and I think the games were canceled, because of world wars. So if you ever needed an excuse, although it stinks for the athletes, I think COVID qualifies as one because it's worldwide.
Yeah. We're not anywhere near globally to be at a point of containment. At the current rate of vaccinations, only about 10% of the world is going to be vaccinated by the end of the year, and only 21% by the end of 2022. And so really, like, just think about that. And I think that's what you want. And there's this, like, I do feel bad for athletes. Don't get me wrong. I get that there's a small window to be of life, to be an elite athlete. That window has passed for me.
But I hope they're thinking of their own health. But I hope they're thinking of their own health too, because there have been so many legendary stories of athletes' villages where parties go wild. Let's be honest. And so I hope they think of their own health and think, I don't want to get it, spread it, but we don't know that that's not going to happen either.
It's parties and romances, Mel. But also, Cynthia, you talked about like 10% of the population being vaccinated. And does this set up like some sort of hierarchy within the countries who are sending athletes to the Olympics? Because it's so confusing, these guidelines. We're not going to make athletes get vaccinated, but we encourage you to get them vaccinated. So what if certain countries have a better vaccination program for their athletes? Then they go and represent at the games, and they end up winning more than other countries who aren't able to vaccinate. Like, are these Olympics actually going to be fair, or do you have to asterisk the medalists next to each sport, considering that were they really competing against the best in the world?
Great point.
Yeah, it's a great point. This is from La 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 Lily. I think I got that right on Twitter. To be honest, I feel the same way about this as I do about major league sports teams being able to get tested every single day with no issue. And I have to jump through 10 hoops to even get an appointment for a test. And that's a great point. I think that's the biggest issue is how does someone's daily life compare to something that is, quite frankly, not necessary. It's not a life or death issue to have the Olympics. That's a good point.
And making this comparison to professional sports is a bit tricky because even though, so with professional sports, those athletes are making a lot of money. They're bringing in a lot of money. So I'm going back to the money issue too. And so, I mean, the argument can be made that they're set up to be safe and they're setting up to be tested. And there's a market that wants to watch this and they will make a lot of money. When it comes to the Olympics, we know that people will watch, people will want to see it. So the IOC will make a lot of money, but there's actually not a lot of guarantees that these athletes after this, by putting themselves at risk, will actually be guaranteed to make a life that supports them afterwards. There's been tons of articles talking about how gold doesn't necessarily guarantee that you won't be living paycheck to
But I think that
paycheck for the rest
existed
of your life.
There's actually a
too.
documentary, Cynthia. It's called The Weight of Gold. HBO put it out last year. Michael Phelps headed it, and it was about exactly what you're saying, not just the financial support and the lack thereof, because there are only so few Michael Phelps and Simone Bileses, and all the other athletes are kind of left to flounder. But also the mental health aspect of it. There's not enough support for athletes on mental health. And so I think even before they start wanting to return to the Olympics to what the glory that they were before the pandemic, it's an opportunity for the Olympics for the IOC to take a look at itself and maybe fix something that's broken.
Well, you know what, though? It's a great point, Lanes. And it just made me think of another thing, which is the mental part of any kind of high achieving sports. How do you feel mentally if, let's say, you haven't had the vaccine and you want to perform well and you are in potentially close contact sports with other athletes in your event? How does that play with your brain to think, could I get sick right now? I mean, I don't know how that handles performance, but I know sports psychologists might have something to say about that.